Sheriff Caleb Thorne had already decided to die. Not with a bullet or a rope, but slowly in the dusty silence of his office with a bottle as his only company. The gunshot wound in his side was a constant welcome pain, a reminder of the failure that had cost him everything. He was a lawman who had locked his own heart in a cell and thrown away the key. He didn't need help. He didn't want saving. And then she appeared. A girl with no name and no voice, found standing by the old well like a ghost waiting for a train that would never come. She was brought to his office for one night of shelter, a stray he was meant to forget by morning. He gave her a cot and his silence. He didn't know that she would give him back his life. Deputy Miller, who brought her in, called her a problem. Found her by the well, Sheriff. Hasn't said a word." Caleb looked at the girl, a wisp of a thing wrapped in a silence so thick it was like armor. Her eyes were fixed on the floorboards. He felt nothing. Not pity, not curiosity, just a profound weariness. He pointed to the cot in the corner. "She can stay the night," he grunted, his voice rough. "Don't lock the door." The deputy left and the heavy quiet settled back in. Caleb turned back to his bottle content to let the shadows in the room swallow them both. He had offered a roof to a ghost. He never imagined she was there to banish his own. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving bruises of purple and orange against the hills. Caleb didn't move from his chair, nursing his whiskey and the dull ache in his side. He'd half expected the girl to vanish, to slip away as silently as she'd appeared. But she hadn't. She'd eventually moved to the cot, sinking onto it without a sound, her back ramrod straight. She didn't lie down, didn't touch the thin blanket folded at the foot of the bed. She just sat a small, still statue in the fading light. He should have asked her questions. Her name, where she came from. But the effort felt like climbing a mountain. Words were currency he couldn't afford to spend. Later, when the town had settled into the deep quiet of night, he pushed a tin plate across the floor toward her. It held a piece of dry bread and some salted meat from his own supper. He didn't say a word, just slid it, until it stopped a few feet from her worn-out boots. She flinched at the sound, a small, barely perceptible jerk. For a long moment she stared at the plate. Then slowly, with fingers that trembled, she reached for the bread. She ate it in tiny, deliberate bites, like a bird never taking her eyes off the shadows in the corner. Morning arrived, not with a bang, but with a soft gray light that crept under the door. Caleb had dozed off in his chair, his neck stiff, and his side a fiery protest. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The cot was empty. The plate was on the floor, wiped clean. The girl was gone. A strange pang, not quite disappointment, but something close to it, settled in his chest. He pushed himself to his feet, gritting his teeth, and limped to the doorway to look out at the quiet street. And then he saw her. She wasn't gone. She was at the watering trough down the street next to the livery stable. And she wasn't alone. She was standing beside his horse, an old temperamental stallion named Dust. Her hand was outstretched, not touching, just hovering near the horse's muzzle, and she was talking, not with words. Her lips were moving, forming silent shapes in the cool morning air, a quiet, one-sided conversation. Dust, a horse that shied away from most men, stood perfectly still, his head lowered, listening. Caleb watched unmoving as the girl finally gently rested her palm against the stallion's scarred nose. The horse didn't flinch. He leaned into her touch. Caleb didn't approach. He just watched from the doorway of his office, a strange stillness settling over him. He'd seen men try to gentle that horse for years, men with loud voices and firm hands, and all had failed. Yet this silent wisp of a girl had earned its trust in a single morning. She continued her silent conversation, her fingers tracing the white blaze on Dust's forehead. For the first time, he saw her shoulders relax just a fraction. Out here with the animal, she wasn't a fortress. She was just a girl. He turned back inside the image seared into his mind. He found the old coffee pot, filled it with water, and set it on the small wood-burning stove. The familiar ritual grounded him. By the time the coffee was boiling, she had returned. She stood at the threshold, hesitating as if waiting for a command or a dismissal. Caleb poured the bitter coffee into 2 tin mugs. He pushed one across his desk, then gestured with his head toward the chair opposite him. It was a silent invitation. She looked at the mug, then at him, her eyes guarded. Slowly she stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind her without making a sound. She sat on the very edge of the chair, hands clasped in her lap. She didn't touch the coffee. He took a slow sip from his own mug, the heat a welcome burn. "He's a stubborn beast," Caleb said, his voice rough from disuse. He nodded toward the street. That horse, name's Dust, doesn't take kindly to strangers. Her eyes flickered up at him for a single startling second, then dropped back to her lap. She gave the smallest of shrugs, a gesture that could have meant anything. He seems to like you, Caleb added, more to himself than to her. Silence stretched between them again, but it felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the unspoken image of her hand on his horse. He noticed the way she held herself, a constant low-level tension, the way her gaze darted to the door every time a wagon rattled by outside. She was a stray who had forgotten how to feel safe. He understood that. He hadn't felt safe in his own skin for months. He finished his coffee, the silence a comfortable blanket. When he looked up, he saw she had finally reached for her mug, her small hands wrapped around it, not drinking, just absorbing the warmth. The days fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. She never left the immediate vicinity of the sheriff's office. In the mornings, she would slip out to see the horse, her silent ritual, a fixed point in the shifting dust of the town. She swept the office floor, her movements methodical and noiseless. She'd wipe down the empty cells, fold the blankets, and disappear back to her cot whenever anyone came to the door. She became a part of the office's silence, a ghost who did chores. Caleb never pressed her. He'd leave food on the desk and find the plate clean later. He'd watch her from the corner of his eye, noticing the small things. The way she always positioned herself in a corner, never in the middle of the room. The way a loud noise from the street would make her hands fly to her ears, even if her face remained a perfect still mask. One afternoon, a drunk ranch hand, Hank, was thrown in one of the cells to sober up. He was loud and belligerent, kicking the bars and shouting slurs. Caleb saw the girl retreat to the farthest corner of the room, her body coiled tight, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the cot. She wasn't looking at the man, but at the locked cell door, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed old and familiar. Caleb stood up, ignoring the sharp protest from his ribs. He walked over to Hank's cell. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, his shadow falling over the drunk. "That's enough, Hank," he said, his voice low and cold as a riverstone. The quiet authority in his tone cut through the drunken haze. Hank sputtered, then slumped onto his bunk, muttering. When Caleb turned, he saw the girl was looking at him. Not at the floor, not at the wall, but directly at him. Her expression was unreadable, but the raw panic in her eyes had subsided, replaced by a flicker of something else. Confusion, maybe, or a sliver of surprise. He had used his power not to intimidate her, but to protect her. He simply nodded once, a gesture of reassurance, and went back to his desk. Later that evening, after the town had gone quiet again, she did something new. She took the broom, and instead of just sweeping the floor, she carefully swept the dust and cobwebs from the top of his bookshelf, a place that hadn't been touched in years. It was a small, silent thank you. And Caleb, watching the firelight glint off the silver star he no longer felt he deserved, understood it completely. The wound in Caleb's side began to heal the sharp fire, dulling to a persistent ache. But another older wound inside him began to stir. Her quiet presence was like a gentle rain on parched earth, awakening things he thought had died. He found himself speaking more not to her directly, but into the space between them. Little things. Stories about the town, about the cantankerous old mule that used to belong to the blacksmith, about the way the sky looked just before a thunderstorm. She never responded, but he knew she was listening. He could feel it in the way she would pause her sweeping and the slight tilt of her head. He wasn't talking to fill the silence. He was talking because for the first time in a long time the silence didn't feel empty. One evening he was cleaning his gun, the methodical click and slide of metal a familiar comfort. She sat on her cot, mending a tear in her thin dress with a needle and thread she'd found in an old drawer. The lamplight cast long dancing shadows on the walls. My wife, Sarah, Caleb said, his voice softer than he intended. She loved horses, said they understood things people couldn't. He saw her needle pause for a beat. Just one. Then it continued its steady, silent work. She was the one who brought Dust here, found him as a colt abandoned, said he had a fighter's spirit. He ran a cloth over the barrel of his pistol. I guess she was right. He fought me at every turn. After she was gone, I couldn't get near him. He saw her in me, I think, or maybe he saw her absence. He fell silent, the weight of the confession hanging in the air. He hadn't spoken his wife's name aloud in over a year. He risked a glance at the girl. She had stopped sewing. Her hands were still in her lap. Her head was bowed, and he thought for a moment he had burdened her, pushed her too far. Then she stood up. She walked not to her cot, but to the coffee pot on the cold stove. She picked it up, then looked at him, her eyes asking a clear, silent question. It was the first time she had initiated anything. A warmth spread through Caleb's chest, chasing away some of the chill that had lived there for so long. He nodded. "I'd like that," he said. And as she prepared the coffee, her movements sure and quiet in the lamplight, Caleb felt the hard knot of grief inside him loosen just a little. The next day, the doctor came to check on Caleb's wound. He was a portly man with a booming voice that filled every corner of the small office. As he unwrapped the bandage, the girl retreated to her corner, making herself as small as possible. "Healing up nicely, Sheriff," the doctor declared, prodding the tender flesh. "But you're still pale. You're not just healing a gunshot, you're healing a loss. It takes time." Caleb didn't answer, his jaw tight. "Speaking of which," the doctor said, gesturing toward the girl, "Miller tells me you've taken in a stray. Can't have her staying in a jail, Caleb. It's not right. What's her name?" Caleb looked over at the girl. She had her arms wrapped around her knees, her face hidden. "She hasn't said," he replied, his voice flat. "Well, she can't stay here forever," the doctor insisted, packing his bag. "The church can find a place for her, or Mrs. Gable is looking for a girl to help with the laundry." Before Caleb could respond, the girl shot to her feet. The sudden movement was so out of character, it startled both men. Her eyes, wide with a familiar panic, flew to Caleb. It wasn't a plea, it was a silent scream. "Don't send me away." The thought was so clear in her gaze, it was like she'd shouted it. He saw in that instant that the world outside this quiet, dusty office was the real prison for her. This was her sanctuary. Caleb's voice was firm when he spoke, cutting off the doctor's chatter. "She's fine where she is. She's helping me, keeping the place in order while I'm laid up." The doctor raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He knew that tone. It was the sheriff's final word. After the doctor left, the office was quiet again. The girl slowly sank back onto her cot, the tension easing from her shoulders. She didn't look at Caleb, but he felt the change in the air. He had defended her. He had chosen her silence over the world's noise. That night, for the first time, she didn't eat on her cot. She pulled the spare chair from the corner and sat at the other side of his desk. They ate their meal of bread and beans in their usual silence, but it was a shared table now. When she was finished, she stood, took his empty plate along with her own, and carried them to the wash basin. It was a simple act, one of domesticity, of partnership. It was the closest thing to a promise he could imagine. And Caleb knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he wouldn't be sending her away. Not now. Not ever. A month passed. The scar on Caleb's side was a pale, puckered line. The whiskey bottle on his shelf gathered dust. The quiet between him and the girl was no longer a void, but a language. He learned the meaning of her silences, the tense, watchful quiet when a stranger entered, the soft, peaceful quiet when she was with the horse, the hesitant, questioning quiet when she stood near his desk. He started leaving the office door open in the evenings. They would sit in his chair on the boardwalk, she on the steps, watching the town settle. She never spoke, but one night she pointed to a configuration of stars. Caleb, following her gaze, told her its name, the Hunter. The next night she pointed again. He told her about the 7 sisters. They were charting the heavens without a single word passing from her lips. One afternoon, he returned from a walk, his first real walk around town, to find her not in the office but in the small stable behind it, brushing dust. The horse's coat shone in the slivers of light cutting through the wooden slats. She was humming. It was a faint, tuneless sound, almost like the buzzing of a bee, but it was the first sound he had ever heard her make. It stopped the moment she sensed his presence. He didn't mention it. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe. "I found this at the general store," he said, holding out a small leather-bound book and a piece of chalk. "It's a primer for learning letters." She stared at the book, then at him, her eyes filled with a deep, bottomless apprehension. "No one has to know," he said gently. "Just a thing between us. Thought you might like to give a name to the things you see." He placed the book and the chalk on a hay bale between them and walked away, giving her the space to choose. That night the lamp in the office burned late. When Caleb woke from a doze in his chair, he saw her hunched over the book at his desk. The chalk was in her hand, and on the small slate he used for notes was a single shaky letter. A. His heart ached with a feeling he couldn't name. It was more than pride. It was hope. He stood and walked over his boots soft on the floorboards. She didn't flinch. He pointed to the letter, then gently took the chalk and drew a horse beside it, simple and crude. He looked at her and she looked at him, and then her lips parted. A sound, fragile as a moth's wing, broke the silence. "Dust," she whispered. Her own voice seemed to startle her. Her eyes widened, and tears she had held back for what seemed like a lifetime finally spilled silent and hot down her cheeks. Caleb didn't move to comfort her. He didn't touch her. He just stood beside her, a steady, unwavering presence in the quiet office, as the girl who spoke only to horses finally found a word for the man who had taught her how to speak again. The silence was broken. Not with a crash, but with a whisper. And in that whisper, life began anew. The single word, dust, hung in the air between them, a fragile bird taking flight for the first time. Caleb didn't move. He didn't wipe her tears or offer empty comforts. He simply stood beside her, a silent witness to the dam breaking. He understood that these weren't tears of sadness, but of a long, frozen river finally beginning to thaw. He let them fall. He let the silence that followed hold her until her trembling subsided. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red-rimmed, but clear as if washed clean from the inside. She pointed a shaky finger at the book at the next letter. B. A slow smile, the first genuine one in over a year, touched Caleb's lips. He picked up the chalk. The lessons became their new evening ritual. The dusty office, once a monument to his grief, transformed into a schoolhouse for two. He would point to objects' desk lamp chair, and she would whisper their names, her voice gaining a quiet confidence with each new word. He taught her the alphabet. She in turn taught him patience he didn't know he had. She learned to read sentences from the worn primer, her finger tracing the words as she sounded them out. One day she pointed to the silver star on his desk. "Caleb," she said, her voice clear and steady. It was the first time she had said his name. He felt it land in his chest like a balm. He pointed to her. A long pause. She looked down at her hands, then back at him, a shadow passing through her eyes. Then she spoke a name so softly he almost didn't hear it. Anna. Anna. It suited her. It was a name that felt like a quiet dawn. The town noticed the change. They saw the way the sheriff walked with a lighter step. They saw the girl, Anna, walking beside him to the livery, not behind him. They saw her look up when people spoke. She still didn't speak to them, but she was no longer invisible. The silence around her was no longer one of fear, but of choice. One evening, as they sat on the boardwalk watching the last light paint the sky, she turned to him. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked. "For the silence," she whispered, "and for showing me how to break it." Caleb looked at her, at the girl he'd taken in out of a weary sense of duty, who had become the center of his quiet world. He looked at the office behind them, no longer a tomb, but a place of soft light and shared coffee. The star on his chest didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a promise. He reached out his calloused hand, covering hers where it rested on the step. It was the first time he had touched her. She didn't pull away. She simply turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. Together they watched the first star appear in the twilight sky. Two lonely souls who had found in each other's silence not an end, but the beginning of a new language, a new life. The office was no longer a place of law and grief. It was just home. The first frost of autumn laid a silver blanket over the dusty street of redemption. The lessons continued, but they changed. Anna was no longer just learning words. She was beginning to tell stories. Not her own, not yet, but tales from the books Caleb brought back from the mercantile. She'd read aloud in the evenings, her voice still soft, but gaining the cadence of the narrative. The office would fill with stories of faraway places, of brave women and lost sailors, and for a little while the world outside their small circle would cease to exist. Caleb, listening from his chair, would watch the way her face animated as she read, the way a small smile would touch her lips at a happy turn, or her brow would furrow in concern. He was seeing the person who had been locked away behind the silence. One crisp morning, Caleb found her not with dust, but standing by the old sagging fence behind the office, staring out at the open plains. The wind whipped strands of her hair across her face. "It's big," she said when he came to stand beside her. "The world?" he asked. She shook her head. "The quiet." He understood. Out here the silence wasn't the suffocating kind of a small room. It was vast, open, and free. It didn't press in. It invited you out. I have to go into the next county tomorrow, he said, his gaze on the horizon. Deputy business. It's a full day's ride there and back. He hesitated. The office will be here. You'll be safe. He saw a flicker of the old panic in her eyes. The thought of being left alone even in this safe space was a ghost she hadn't yet exorcised. She looked down, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. He cleared his throat, or he said slowly, an idea forming as he spoke. Dust could use a long ride, and I have a gentler mare in the stable that hasn't been out in a while. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a question she didn't dare speak. It's a long road, Caleb said, a faint smile on his lips. I could use the company. The next morning, as the sun broke over the plains, they rode out of Redemption side by side. Anna was mounted on the gentle bay mare, her back straight, her hands holding the reins with a new confidence. The town watched them go, the wounded sheriff and the silent girl riding out into the vast quiet together. For Anna, it was the first time she had willingly left the safety of the town's borders. For Caleb, it was the first time in a long time he hadn't felt like he was riding alone. The road stretched out before them, an unwritten page, and for the first time they were ready to write their story on it together. The ride was mostly silent, but it was a silence of companionship, punctuated by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the soft creak of saddle leather. The plains unfolded around them, a tapestry of gold and brown under a vast cloudless sky. Caleb pointed out landmarks: a lone butte shaped like a sleeping giant, a dried-up riverbed where outlaws used to hide, a patch of land where wild mustangs sometimes ran. Anna didn't speak much, but her eyes absorbed everything. She rode with a natural grace, as if she were born to the saddle. At midday, they stopped by a small gurgling creek shaded by a cluster of cottonwoods. Caleb untied the saddlebags and laid out a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried apples. They sat on the creek bank, the horses drinking nearby. It was the first time they had been truly alone, away from the prying eyes of the town. The air felt different here, cleaner, lighter. I used to come here with Sarah, Caleb said quietly, breaking a piece of bread. We'd talk about building a small ranch right over there. He gestured with his chin to a flat stretch of land, a place away from the trouble of being a lawman. Anna listened, her gaze soft. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone she must have picked up from the creek bed. She held it out to him on her palm. Caleb looked at it, then at her. What's this for? A memory, she whispered. So you don't just have the old ones. The simplicity of it struck him. She wasn't offering pity or trying to fix his past. She was just giving him a new moment to place alongside the old ones. He took the stone, its surface cool and smooth against his calloused skin, and closed his hand around it. Thank you, Anna, he said, and the words felt more meaningful than any he'd spoken in years. On the ride back, as the sun began its slow descent, a chill wind picked up. Anna shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter. Without a word, Caleb reined in. His horse shrugged out of his heavy duster coat and leaned over to drape it around her shoulders. It was far too big for her, but she sank into its warmth, her small frame enveloped in the scent of leather and dust and him. They rode into Redemption as twilight settled, the lamps in the windows beginning to glow. The coat was a silent statement to the whole town. When he helped her dismount in front of the office, his hands briefly on her waist, the touch was steady and respectful, but it was a touch that lingered in the cool air long after he let go. Inside, she didn't retreat to her cot. She stood by the stove, still wrapped in his coat, and watched him light the lamp. The office, their sanctuary, felt smaller, more intimate than before. Caleb, she said, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. He turned to her. My pa, she started, her voice trembling slightly. He had a loud voice and fast hands. He didn't like noise. So I learned to be quiet. It was the first piece of her story she had ever offered, a shard of glass from her broken past held out for him to see. He didn't ask for more. He just nodded slowly, his eyes holding hers, filled with an understanding that required no further explanation. He knew what it was like to be haunted, but as he looked at her standing there in his coat, he realized that for the first time, neither of them were facing their ghosts alone.